Well, come on up, Steve. It's interesting to meet so many different people from around the United States, but it's great to have someone coming from England. And I was telling Steve earlier that my mother is from England, and I'm working on getting dual citizenship right now. And but then I was saying, I wish Brexit wouldn't have happened, because then you're going to be part of the European Union. Yeah. But it's a good thing having you here. And you have been a prophetic voice. Your story yesterday about having your conversion experience and seeing the young children in that house, just and then at that point saying, this is what's going to happen, is powerful. And I would like at some point for you to kind of give us some courage, because many of us who are ministers in this world right now, we want to be prophetic, but sometimes it's hard when you're living in a congregation that we call purple, mixture of more conservative or more liberal place. So I would just love to hear from you about how can we be that voice and to be a prophetic voice. So thank you.
Whoa. Good morning, everybody. It's good. It's really good to see you. So, Tommy, that's a great challenge. How do we do that? And I hope to address that. I'm going to talk for a while and then leave some time for questions. But I'd like to begin by telling you a very ancient story. It's the story in Greek mythology of the creation of women. And it was written, first of all, by a man called Hesiod. I don't know if you've ever read any of Hesiod's poems. He lived about 8 centuries before Jesus. He was contemporary with Homer. We don't really know whether Homer was actually a person, do we? Or just a group of playwrights who slowly evolved those great stories and plays. But everybody knows that Hesiod lived, and he wrote some epic poems. And in one of his epic poems is this story. And then I'll explain why I'm telling you the story. You'll recognize some of it. The gods, the Greek gods, had created men. They created the world and they created men, but not women, just men. And men fought with the gods. The gods were on a par with the men, and they often had these wars between one another. And in Hesiod, in this great epic poem, Works and Days it's called, he tells this story. And one of the gods, Prometheus, had given human beings, the men, the gift of fire. And Zeus, the king of the gods, was really annoyed. In fact, if you know much about Zeus, he spent most of his life being annoyed at something. He was an angry god. And what he did was he banished Prometheus for doing this stupid thing, because he believed that being given men fire, he had given them power, and that would create equality, and that was not what was wanted. So he punished Prometheus for what he'd done, and then he called a council together. And in his council of his brothers and sisters, this group of gods, he came up with a scheme. And he ordered 2 of his sisters because there were female gods, he ordered 2 of his sisters to create a woman, the first ever woman. And they created Pandora. It was only yesterday that I was talking to someone here and they were telling me about a Pandora's box of things. That's where a Pandora's box comes from Hesiod. So Hesiod tells this story, this creation myth, this Greek creation myth for women. He tells this story of how Pandora is created. And then Zeus steps forward and he gives to Pandora this beautiful woman who is asked to be created with real beauty, but with an ice-cold heart. He steps forward and he gives to Pandora what we call Pandora's box. Actually, to tell you the truth, because I'm a bit into Greek, ancient Greek, it's a mistranslation of the word. It was actually a jar. It was Pandora's jar, but Pandora's box is what we've ended up with. And In Pandora's jar, in Pandora's box, there were what Zeus said were gifts for the men of the planet Earth. And so he sends Pandora, this beautiful woman, to Earth. And her job is to entice to entice the king of Greece. Because if you can entice the king and, wrap him round your fingertips with your sexual allure, then you're going to get fire back. So Pandora arrives in front of the king, and he falls instantly in love with her. He's seduced by her. But on Zeus's commands, Zeus shouts from the heavens, and he shouts to Pandora, and he says, "Open the box!" And at that moment, Pandora, the first ever woman, has to open the box on his order, and she opens the box, Pandora's box, and out of the box fly all sorts of terrible problems for humanity. Out of the box flies the gift, inverted commas, of war, and the gift of pestilence, and the gift of need, and the gift of famine, and the gift of droughts, and the gift of illness, and the gift of death, etc., etc. All of these gifts fly out of the box. And then Zeus thunders, "Shut the box!" And Pandora shuts the box, with, as Hesiod says, one of the gifts left inside. And the poem reveals that the gift that has been left inside is the gift of hope. Hope is locked in Pandora's box. Pestilence and plague and famine and death are out of the box. Poverty is out of the box, but hope is locked in the box. And says Hesiod, humanity can cope with plague, and it can cope with poverty. It can cope with war and famine and disease, but it cannot cope without hope. Robbed of hope, there is no future. And those of you who perhaps know that poem and know that story will know that it's been written about and debated through the centuries, through 8 centuries to the birth of Jesus, and then onwards by endless scholars to the present date. What does it mean, and what does it tell us? Why do I tell you that story? Because the Apostle Paul, the young man about a decade younger than Jesus, who met with Jesus on the road to Damascus and had his life transformed and turned around, so that with every ounce of the energy until that point that he'd put into the persecution of this Jewish sect of people who followed a dead Messiah. That was the problem. You can't follow a dead Messiah, because a dead Messiah is no Messiah. The Messiah is supposed to liberate Israel and bring hope. And therefore, because Jesus is dead, he cannot be the Messiah. He cannot be the Messiah. But on that road, as Paul is knocked to the ground, and he hears the voice of Jesus. Paul, Saul, Saul. By the way, some people claim that Saul was called Saul till he became a Christian, and then he changed his name to Paul. Have you heard that? That's wrong on all counts. First of all, if you actually read the Acts of the Apostles, one is his Hebrew name and one's his Greek name, and he carries them both onwards. That's the truth. Because he's a Jew, but he lives in a Greek city, so he's got a Greek name, Paul, and he's got a Hebrew name, Saul, and he's probably got several others. That's one thing. But the second thing is Paul never became a Christian, just like Jesus. Jesus was not a Christian, and nor was Paul, ever. It's an extraordinary thing for the church not to grasp, isn't it? Jesus was born a Jew and died a Jew. He was, for those of you who want to take any notes and go away and think about this, Jesus was what was called a Second Temple Jew. And so Paul was a Second Temple Jew as well. So what Paul believed was that the Messiah was coming and he'd rid Israel at last of the Romans. You know, before that it was the Greeks. We'd get them out, and at last the temple would be complete and we will worship God. That's what all Second Temple Jews believed. So they were waiting for the Messiah to arrive to drive out the Romans and bring them liberty, which is why the crowds on Palm Sunday cried, "Hosanna, Hosanna, you're the Messiah, you're here, you're here." But instead of Jesus leading this rebellion, instead of that, he turned a different way because he was a Messiah of peace, not of war. And that's what they didn't understand. So Jesus is crucified, and Paul cannot now believe that this man is the Messiah, because we need an alive Messiah. You've got to be alive to beat the Romans down. You've got to be alive to lead us into victory. You've got to be alive to bring down the promises of God of freedom. But what Paul didn't understand is that the freedom Jesus was talking about and speaks to us about is not a freedom through military power and crushing enemies. It's a freedom of our soul to live and to love and to connect and to rejoice. So here's Paul, on the road to Damascus, on the way to hunt down the followers of this Jewish sect who believed in a dead Messiah. What a stupid thing was that, at that critical moment in time. And then he hears the voice of Jesus speaking to him. And with all the passion he pursued that Jewish sect that he believed was wrong up until that moment, from then on he gave his whole life to traveling around the known world in all the transport systems available, which were basically walking donkeys and ships that regularly sunk. That's what Paul did. He spent his life traveling and working and writing because he had been liberated and given freedom, spiritual freedom, freedom of connection. His life was transformed. Now, it so happens, as you probably know, that Paul grew up in a city called Tarsus. Paul of Tarsus, yeah? What was Tarsus? It was a Greek university city. But it didn't do mathematics. That wasn't its thing. And it didn't do history. It wasn't the Greek center of historic thinking. It was the center. It was the leading it was the Yale or the Oxford of philosophy and arts and thought. So Saul knew the story of Hesiod. For all Greek thinkers, Homer and Hesiod were like the Old Testament to us. And Aristotle was like the New Testament. And to understand any of the New Testament writers and the books that make up the library, which is the New Testament, without understanding Homer and Hesiod and Aristotle is to not understand what Paul is writing about. And that's the problem, one of the problems for us as we move forward. A text without a context is a pretext for any old assumption you want to make. And so the point is this. What Paul understands is the hope had been locked in the box. Everybody knew that story. It was one of the dominating stories. It was the Greek creation story. And what Paul has come to understand on that road to Damascus is the hope has got out of the box. And his life is therefore committed to the bringing of hope. Does that make sense? A few centuries later, the 4th century, very famous black African church leader, bishop, who's dominated Christian history in many ways ever since. His name was Augustine. We call him Saint Augustine. Augustine of Hippo, which nowadays would be in Algeria. And Augustine, who understood all this because he was a great thinker too. I've not talked about Aristotle's influence on the New Testament, but so much of what Paul writes about is counteracting what Aristotle had said. Perhaps I'll talk about that. But it's true. You know, you can't say it again. You can't read any text out of the context in which it was written and ever think you're understanding it, which is why we need to study the Bible rather than just read it. Two big different things. So, back to Augustine. Augustine once said this, speaking of hope. Hesiod's poem influenced everyone in that world. He said this, hope has two beautiful daughters. The first is called anger. Anger at the way things are. The second is called courage. Courage to ensure that they do not remain that way. Hope has two beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are. Courage to ensure that they do not remain that way. So it comes for us to lift hope out of the box in our generation. And that hope is the message of Jesus. I love Martin Luther King. He's one of my heroes. You know, as a Baptist minister, I'm a Baptist minister, so, you know, I kind of like, and he was like, you know, that I have a dream speech, which undoubtedly, in my view, is the best piece of oratory of the 20th century by a country mile. And you probably know that, you know, like all great speakers, he practiced what he was saying lots of times before, you know, and he'd given that I have a dream speech on numerous occasions, even a few nights before he'd given it elsewhere, and it evolved. And he was standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, wasn't he, speaking on that momentous day? And things he was speaking, lots of other people had spoken and sung and et cetera, and he was speaking, and if you listen to the speech, it's going okay, you know, and he's reading off a script that he's been given and et cetera. It's all going okay. And you probably know the story that one of his friends, a singer who'd been with him the night before, whispers, you can actually hear it on some of their things. She says, tell him about the dream. Tell him about the dream, Martin. And when she says, tell him about the dream, when she said, she repeats it twice, then you can see his eyes lift from his script. And he goes into, I have a dream. Those extraordinary statements, extraordinary motivating statements. Here's the thing, though. I've often thought about it. I've listened to that so many times. Why didn't Martin Luther King Jr. ever say, I have a nightmare? I've got a real nightmare. We've got a real nightmare as the American people. What are we going to do? We are in the middle of a frigging big nightmare. Martin Luther King only ever said, I have a dream. Because Martin's theology was deep, actually. And I am sure that he knew the story of Hesiod and the story of Jesus and the story of Paul and understood that we got to get hope out the box. Martin and his team were also great strategists, not just speech givers. America, as is Europe, as is the UK, which chose to leave Europe, which was a pretty stupid thing to do. Especially as we're in Europe, you know, you leave the thing you're actually part of. It's kind of, yeah, that's progress for you. You know, kind of small island mentality. Let's isolate ourselves from everybody. Where's that idea come from? You know, kind of like. So, yeah, you've got me off track now. Yeah, so the point is this. The point is this, the situation we face together to many will seem hopeless, all of us. And it's easy to say we're in the middle of a nightmare. We're in the middle of a national nightmare. We're in the middle of a nightmare for the church, which seems so antiquated and irrelevant to the issues that are being addressed. But Martin Luther King, this great theologian, actually, besides being an orator, he said, I've got a dream. And the dream was about bringing hope. So I'd like to say a few things about hope and then be practical about it. Hope, you know, is a warrior. Hope is not an easy thing. Hope is not a shallow thing. Hope is a deep thing. To hope is a lonely journey. To hope is a journey of pain. But to hope, as Augustine said, is courage. Hope is not a fearless thing, but hope digs its feet in, and it looks forward, and it moves forward. That's why Martin Luther King never said, I have a nightmare. He knew the nightmare of the situation and the oppression of his people. But his hope was resolute. Hope is a warrior spirit. And hope has to be based on something deep. So, you know, in our society, in fact, you know, I don't know, there's a band in the UK, I don't know if it's made it here, it's called Dream. And Dream had a single 2 decades ago called Things Can Only Get Better. And when Tony Blair became the Prime Minister in the UK, the anthem song was Things Can Only Get Better, Things Can Only Get Better. You know, and you just think, no, it's not true, they can get a whole lot worse. And in fact, they did. And they continue to get worse. And then when Keir Starmer, you know, our Prime Minister, who's been to see Donald a few times, he was elected, they chose the same song. And they played it out. It was the anthem as Keir Starmer walked on stage, having become Prime Minister. Things can only get better. I just read on the BBC News this morning, we're in a worse state than we've ever been. That's what they said. We all know things can get a whole lot worse, and they will unless we get hope out the box. So let me tell you something about the Hebrew words, the Hebrew word for hope. Hebrew, the language in which the Old Testament collection of books that are in the library called the Bible, you know, I always call it a library because you don't want to fall into thinking the Bible's a book. If you were here yesterday, I talked about this, but once you think the Bible is a book, you are done for, because it's not a book, it's a library. It's a library with different opinions, different voices, different outlooks from different times. Why does the Bible say do this here and then Jesus say don't do that? Because the do this, you know, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and then later Jesus says, I'm telling you that's rubbish. You know, I'm telling you love your enemy. Why is this contradiction in the Bible? Because an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth was written in the Middle Bronze Age and represents Middle Bronze Age morality. And Jesus didn't live in the Middle Bronze Age, so he didn't represent Middle Bronze Age mentality. So it's vitally important to understand that the Bible is a collection of books written over at least 1,000 years in several different languages, not just Hebrew and Greek, but there's bits of other language as well, by different people with different outlooks and different politics, etc., etc., etc. But Hebrew, the prime language of the Old Testament, like many ancient languages, was very concrete. I'll explain what that means. So nouns in Hebrew tended to be built on describing words, verbs, etc., etc. And because it's a concrete language, the nouns were about things you could see or touch or feel or taste, etc. So here's an interesting thing. The noun for nose, in Hebrew, the main word, there are several words for nose, I should say, but the main word for nose in Hebrew is exactly the same as the main word for anger. the verb for anger is exactly the same as the noun for nose. Why is that? Because when you are angry, your nostrils flare. So in the context of a Hebrew sentence, it's like, I don't know, his daughter had just stepped on his toe and crushed it, and he was it's got to be angry, not nose. He was very nose, He had a bad cold, so he blew his nose, not anger. Did you see? That's how you do it. So why do I tell you that? The main word for hope in the Hebrew language, there are several, but the one that's used more often than any others is exactly the same word as the noun for a multi-stranded woven rope. A multi-stranded woven rope. The Hebrew name is tikva. Tikva means hope, and it also means multi-stranded woven rope. Why is that? Because the Hebrew people knew that when you're down a deep hole, you don't want someone at the top going, "Don't worry, things can only get better." You want someone or some people who've woven together a multi-stranded strong rope, and they pass you down one end of it whilst they all hang on to the other end and they pull you out. In other words, the biblical understanding of hope is not the kind of hope that gets talked about normally. It's not a chin up, look on the bright side. It's real, it's tangible. And if the progressive church in America or the UK or anywhere else on earth has really found liberation, that liberation must consist of creating, forming, weaving multi-stranded woven ropes that are strong enough to lift people out of despair and poverty and lack of hope. So that's what we have to be. We have to be strategists, planners, thinkers. The problem, even with me giving this little talk, is, as I've learned over the years, because I'm a preacher, I've been doing this for a long time, is you go and you talk like this. And because of our context, who we are, what happens is you say we need to weave a multi-stranded woven rope. We need strategies and plans to liberate people. And if there are 100 people in the room, 100 people go, "What am I going to do?" Because we are so individualistic. And none of us hear what's actually said. It's a multi-stranded woven rope. It's about us. As you know, for the vast majority of the time, when the New Testament uses the term you, it doesn't mean you, me, it means us. It's the plural us. And what happens constantly in the caring world with NGOs, with not-for-profits, with charities, with churches, with people in churches, is you have endless individuals doing their thing to make their contribution instead of us doing our thing together with a multi-stranded woven rope that's going to make difference in our community, in our place. Does that make sense to you? Yeah. So the question is, how does the gracious, liberated, liberating, liberal left organize itself to bring a multi-stranded woven rope, which is real hope, to those in need. And until we do this, nothing will change. Nothing will change. When I became a Christian, which was when I was 14, I was telling this story yesterday, so I won't tell it all again, how I became a Christian. But let me say this. Let me just say this bit. I don't think I said this yesterday. My dad's died now. My dad was Indian, and my mum white. And so I grew up in South London at a time when racism was real. I mean, you know, my mum married my dad, who was very, very dark-skinned, which is why I turn out this colour. And half her family never, ever came to the house to visit her again because she'd married this very dark-skinned Indian, almost jet black, my dad. And I remember as a kid walking the streets of South London, my dad would take me to school or pick me up, depending on his shift. He did shift work. And people literally crossed the road in front of us to the other side. Britain is still a deeply racist country, but it's at least moved on from that. And the reality is that I grew up, therefore, in poverty. My dad found it very hard to find work. My mum couldn't find work. We grew up in proper poverty. We never had a toilet in our house. We never had heating. We had no hot water. I never went on a holiday. We never went on holidays. My parents had no bank account. We had no car. We had all that kind of thing. I was constantly taking the mickey out of because of my colour. But here's the thing: I never thought of it as a bad thing. I didn't know it was a bad thing. I just thought it was the thing. I just thought that's life. So it didn't impact me in that way at all. But I think that what it did for me was something great. When I became a Christian, and I was told, pray this prayer because you'll go to heaven after you die. It's like, take out this eternal insurance policy. I mean, I know it's going to be rough for the first 60 years. You're going to have to go to a lot of very boring church services, which you don't want to be in, and listen to dreary talks that put you to sleep endlessly. I know it's going to be tough on you, and you've got to go to endless prayer meetings where everybody sits there in silence and embarrassed to pray and all that. I know you've got to put up with all of that, but just think of the long-term benefits. It's going to pay off after you're dead, So that's the Christianity I grew up in. It's the Christianity I was converted into. But here's the extraordinary thing for me. I was saved, I think, from that by my upbringing. Because it was a really weird thing for me from the first day of being a Christian. Even though I was officially told it was all about booking your seat on the heavenly bus kind of thing, I somehow knew it wasn't. I somehow knew it was about something else. And on the night wandering home through a street in South London, I decided I was going to be a follower of Jesus. In that same breath, I told the story yesterday, so I won't tell it again. In that same breath, I decided when I grow up, I'm going to start a house for kids who are not loved, who are on the streets. And I had friends who were shunted from pillar to post, fostered, looked after, not cared for. And I could see that they were angry inside, but I knew that the anger was the loneliness or the despair or the anxiety. I could work that out. And I decided on that same thing that when I grew up, I was going to start a school. And the school was going to be in a place where nobody wanted to start a school. And it was going to bring hope, get hope out of the box. I'd never heard of Hesiod, of course, but I knew it had to be about hope for these kids. And I was going to start a hospital, and I was going to start health. I was 14, I really was. And I wandered home, and my dad was out doing shift work because he got a job on the railways. He used to collect tickets. But my mum was in, and she said, have you had a nice evening? I said, yeah, I'm going to be a Christian. I'm going to be a Christian leader. And when I grow up, I'm going to start a house and a hospital and a school. And she looked at me. She'd left education about the age of 14. She looked at me and she said, very nice. And because of the kind of school I went to, it was the only careers advice I ever received. Genuinely. And honestly, it was. And it was from my mum, very nice. And And that night became the pivotal moment in my life because hope leapt out of the box for me. I grew up in South London being called half-caste. That was my nickname, half-caste, they called me. I was telling my friend Martin the other day that I had a girlfriend when I was 18 and her parents were Christians, and they told her that she couldn't go out with me anymore because if we got married, our children would be throwbacks, you know. So I grew up with that, but I discovered this hope. My small story was caught up in this big story. So our challenge is, how do we bring this big story to others? Now, I failed all the exams I've ever taken. I'm old enough now that people keep giving me honorary doctorates. You know, truly, I'm going to get one next week. It's hilarious. They're the best kind of degrees to get, let me tell you. Honestly, they are. I've got a few. I could give you one if you like. And they're the greatest degrees to get because you don't have to do any work. Like, no essays, no thinking. You just rock up, do a speech to graduates, graduands, and, at the end they give you this big ribbon and a hat and all the rest of it, and you're a doctor again. So, I'll have to do that next week, So, again, but the funny thing about this is when I actually went to college to do theology, they wouldn't even let me do a degree, because they said I wasn't smart enough to be able to think at that level. So I actually I've got a doctorate in theology, honorary, or 2 or 3, but I've actually not got a real degree for any actual thinking. It's true, because they wouldn't let me do one because I was too stupid from my background and all the rest of it. But here's the thing, I learned, and I have learned, that you don't have to be smart. And I'm saying that to you not because you look stupid to me. I'm saying that to you for a simple reason. I know you feel inadequate, because everyone does. Everyone feels powerless. Everyone feels like, okay, Steve, all this Pope out the box stuff, and let's strategize and let's plan, but we can't do that. I can't do that. You can't, I've got no voice, no one's listening, etc., etc., etc. No one's listening to me. Well, the truth is, inspired, this is my story bit, because it has to be practical. I've talked about Hesiod and Paul and Tarsus and Hebrew thought and what hope really means biblically and all of that kind of. Well, it's a great piece of theology, isn't it? But unless it becomes practical, what do you do? So given this thing at the age of 14, I left school when I was 18, and I went to work in a factory as a labourer, as a sweeper. And I went to work there because I knew that I needed to understand people. And I know that all humans are, I know it, I can articulate it much better than I could then, but I knew that it was all about relationship and knowing people. That's what I knew. What I now know is Homo sapiens have been on the planet for 200 to 300,000 years, nobody's really sure. But over that time, every single human being until very lately, we've been here for 300,000 years, and if you turn that into a 24-hour period, it means that until about 30 seconds ago, in terms of history, every human being lived in a community where they were known. No human being was brought up by a single parent or even 2 parents. Every child was born into a community where that child was nourished and grew through a community that was intergenerational. We know this, don't we, to put it into pictures. We know this actually because the MRI scanner that you know from hospitals, because you go and have an MRI occasionally, the MRI scanner, which was introduced in the late 80s, really, into hospitals for the first time, in the 90s, researchers, maybe one of you, researchers got hold of the idea you could actually use this to understand the human body. And so people began to scan human brains until the 1990s, in your lifetime. Until the 1990s, all understanding of the human brain was conducted because people donated their brains after they were dead to science, and the brains of dead people were sliced up. That's it. But now, over these last 30 years or so, we've had the opportunity to be able to look inside a brain. We can watch a child of hours old, or a few days old, or a few weeks old, or a few months old, and we watch how their brains develop and grow. Let me tell you this, you may know this and you may not know this, but you can look through an MRI scanner at the brain of a 3-year-old child who's not been loved, or the love they've received is inconsistent, because normally the mum has not been there for them. That's not to judge the mum. That's simply to say that when you live in poverty, which is intergenerational, and you're trying to work 3 jobs and you don't have any security yourself, and you're fighting to put food on the table and there is no health care for you, when you're fighting to stay alive and you are on your own and you're not supported and you're lonely and you're looking for love and for your emotional fulfillment in other places, you don't have as much time, therefore, to absorb in your child because you're not secure yourself. This is all intergenerational. But because you're not secure and you can't cuddle and nurture and regulate your child in a way that a middle class family with 2 wage earners or whatever it is would be able to do, actually we know that this doesn't just change the way the child thinks about themselves. You know, they flip themselves around, they're more angry, they're harder to control. We know now it changes the shape of your brain. Human beings have been on the planet Earth for 200,000 years at least, and for all of those 200,000 years except the last 100 years or so, most people have lived in tight-knit communities, and every child has been raised by a community that knows it. And we, in our addiction to being self-made people and stand-alone people and pursuing our status, etc., have abandoned community. But we are community animals. We are relational. And you should do this. You look, because you can see this on Google or wherever you go to look at these things. You can look at the brain of a 3-year-old child that has been loved and nurtured and felt secure in their primary relationships, and it's like a plump cabbage. And you can look at the brain of a 3-year-old child on their birthday who's not had that secure attachment. It's been ambivalent or anxious or not there, and their brain looks like a shriveled walnut. A shriveled walnut. And every church, wonderful, warm, progressive, liberal, kind church, needs to begin, in my view, to organise itself strategically and begin to say, in our community where we are, how do we begin to create village again? Because human brains are adapted to village. We are village people, all of us. That's who we are. There's nothing we can do about it. We are not self-made. Thank you. So what do we do about it? And it strikes me that the wonderful, progressive, kind, loving, generous, inclusive churches of this country are the very best agency in the USA to deliver this, just as they are in the UK. Why? Because it's not, we have care systems, don't we? I was saying this to someone yesterday. You got care systems, but people don't want care systems. They want to be cared for. We've got care that doesn't care for people. It's not just about does the system exist? It's who delivers this care. Is it relational? Is it longitudinal? Am I passed from one officer to the next officer? Am I a case? Am I in a number? Or am I loved and seen and held and understood? So you don't need to be a genius. You do not need a PhD. You do not need a master's degree. You do not need to feel that you've got some great voice. In our communities, we can do this, and this is the only way forward. Care takes time. In the UK, I was telling someone here yesterday, and that one of my daughters is a GP. And in the UK, a GP can only see someone for 10 minutes. Every appointment is 10 minutes long. Every appointment is 10 minutes long, 10 minutes long, 10 minutes long, 10 minutes long. Some appointments with a GP may perhaps only need to be 3 minutes long, but some need to be half an hour long, and some need to be every week, because care takes as long as care takes. It's a labour of love. And only the generous, open, inclusive to everyone church can provide this. You've got the buildings, you've got the facilities, you've got the brains working together. You can create that multi-stranded rope. Thank you. I'm being told that I've got 5 minutes. 4 minutes! It's 3 minutes now. So let me tell you a story and then give you something to go. So I should say that in the UK, Oasis now, I'm this kid who wasn't bright enough to do a degree in any of these things. We run 54 schools in poor, economically, social deprived communities. We have 33,000 children in our schools in tough communities in the country. We run a huge number of housing projects. I don't even know how many housing projects we do. I'm working on a scheme at this very moment in the city of Bristol. We're going to build a new village, 377 houses and a new school with special educational needs, facilities, etc., and some sports spaces and all the rest of it for the community. We're doing all of these things. Oasis is the charity, the Christian charity that I founded, and we now have in the UK around 6,000 staff, and we work in other countries, etc. And I haven't even got a degree. I didn't even get the chance to fail one. I never got access to one. So I'm telling you, I'm probably the most stupid guy stood here. But I'm telling you that if you work with people and form this multi-stranded rope, you can do it. We have to organise. I'll tell you a story to finish with, but first of all, can I say to you, if you write down anything, can you write down this? It's just a website. It's not even for Oasis. It's Academy for Hope, not the number 4, Academy for F-O-R, Hope, academyforhope.org. And I wrote a book called Manifesto for Hope 2 years ago because one of our students was stabbed to death one night through the heart because he tried to pull some kids away from drugs they were being sold. And the next morning, a 5-year-old child, this was in the middle of the pandemic, a 5-year-old child in one of our other schools in a different city, one of our head teachers rang me and said that little Dylan had been murdered by his mother that morning. And she's now in prison serving a long sentence for his murder. Can you imagine the pain and stress and trauma for that young mum on her own through the pandemic, not cared for, not held in community, trying to do the impossible? I'm not excusing her what happened, I'm just understanding it and the pain. I'm telling you this, Jesus only said 2 things. He left us and he said, look, this is the deal. Love the Lord God with all your heart and soul and mind, and love your neighbour as yourself. It's not frigging difficult. You don't have to understand Greek, Hebrew, Latin or anything else. You don't have to have done a degree in theology or psychology or any humanities. You don't need to know anything except know that the most precious gift you've got to give to anyone is time. Time. Time is what the human race thrives on, and without it, we're lost. Can I tell you a story to finish? Right. Can I do that? I don't know if any of us heard of Søren Kierkegaard. Søren Kierkegaard, Christian philosopher, Danish, etc., etc. And Søren Kierkegaard is, I wouldn't try to read much Søren Kierkegaard, It's kind of like, I'm going to tell you Søren Kierkegaard's story and you might be drawn into it, but let me tell you, there are chapters and chapters and chapters of very dense language in the occasional story, which is about 3 lines long. So, but he's fascinated with geese because in Denmark, geese are eaten at Christmas. You don't have turkey or anything like that. You have roast goose. So he tells lots of goose stories, and this is just a pulling together of some of Søren Kierkegaard's goose stories. And the story is simply this. There was a farmyard, and the farmyard was inhabited by a flock of geese. And the farmyard was very safe because it had high walls. And the grain was very good because the farmer supplied grain. And one day a philosopher goose arose amongst the geese. And the philosopher goose said to the other geese, Look at your wings. Look at your wings. We are wild geese. We were meant to fly. Unfurl those wings. Flap those wings. But no geese ever did, because the grain in the farmyard was good and the walls were high and secure. So he told them stories. They loved gathering to meet him. Every Sunday morning, he'd gather them round the pond in the farmyard, and he'd tell them stories of their ancestors that unfurled their wings and flew. He'd tell them about landscapes, forests, seascapes, mountains, fields. He told them about how their forefathers had caught the thermals and soared, how they migrated around the earth. He'd tell them about the majestic legacy that was theirs because they were wild geese. And they loved what he said. And they began to write poetry about aerodynamics and their forefathers who flew these wild geese. And they began to sing songs and write papers and form strategies. They began to meet together on a regular basis. But what they never did was this: fly. Because the walls of the farmyard were secure and the grain was good. This festival is called Wild Goose because the Celtic Christians, as I'm sure you know, ditched the idea of the Holy Spirit as a dove. They ditched it, and the Celtic Christians said, no, the people of God led by the Holy Spirit are wild geese. Be wild geese. God bless you.